Morgenthau MP, the 3rd of February 6. Hans J. Morgenthau, Politics Among Nations, The Struggle for Power and Peace. 6 Principles of Political Realism. 1. Political realism believes that politics, like society in general, is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. In order to improve society, it is first necessary to understand the laws by which society lives. The operation of these laws being impervious to our preferences, man will challenge them only at the risk of failure. Realism, believing as it does in the objectivity of the laws of politics, must also believe in the possibility of developing a rational theory that reflects, however imperfectly and one-sidedly, these objective laws. It believes also, then, in the possibility of distinguishing in politics between truth and opinion, between what is true objectively and rationally, supported by evidence and illuminated by reason, and what is only a subjective judgment, divorced from the facts as they are and informed by prejudice and wishful thinking. Human nature, in which the laws of politics have their roots, has not changed since the classical philosophies of China, India, and Greece endeavored to discover these laws. Hence, novelty is not necessarily a virtue in political theory, nor is old age a defect. The fact that a theory of politics, if there be such a theory, has never been heard of before tends to create a presumption against, rather than in favor of, its soundness. Conversely, the fact that a theory of politics was developed hundreds or even thousands of years ago, as was the theory of the balance of power, does not create a presumption that it must be outmoded and obsolete. A theory of politics must be subjected to the dual test of reason and experience. To dismiss such a theory because it had its flowering in centuries past is to present not a rational argument but a modernistic prejudice that takes for granted the superiority of the present over the past. To dispose of the revival of such a theory as a fashion or fad is tantamount to assuming that in matters political we can have opinions but no truths. For realism, theory consists in ascertaining facts and giving them meaning through reason. It assumes that the character of a foreign policy can be ascertained only through the examination of the political acts performed and of the foreseeable consequences of these acts. Thus we can find out what statesmen have actually done, and from the foreseeable consequences of their acts we can surmise what their objectives might have been. Yet examination of the facts is not enough. To give meaning to the factual raw material of foreign policy, we must approach political reality with a kind of rational outline, a map that suggests to us the possible meanings of foreign policy. In other words, we put ourselves in the position of a statesman who must meet a certain problem of foreign policy under certain circumstances, and we ask ourselves what the rational alternatives are from which a statesman may choose who must meet this problem under these circumstances, presuming always that he acts in a rational manner, and which of these rational alternatives this particular statesman, acting under these circumstances, is likely to choose. It is the testing of this rational hypothesis against the actual facts and their consequences that gives theoretical meaning to the facts of international politics. 0. The main signpost that helps political realism to find its way through the landscape of international politics is the concept of interest defined in terms of power. This concept provides the link between reason trying to understand international politics and the facts to be understood. It sets politics as an autonomous sphere of action and understanding apart from other spheres, such as economics, understood in terms of interest defined as wealth, ethics, aesthetics, or religion. Without such a concept, a theory of politics, international or domestic, would be altogether impossible, for without it we could not distinguish between political and non-political facts, nor could we bring at least a measure of systematic order to the political sphere. We assume that statesmen think and act in terms of interest defined as power, and the evidence of history bears that assumption out. That assumption allows us to retrace and anticipate, as it were, the steps of statesmen, past, present, or future, has taken or will take on the political scene. We look over his shoulder when he writes his dispatches. We listen in on his conversation with other statesmen. We read and anticipate his very thoughts. Thinking in terms of interest defined as power, we think as he does, and as disinterested observers we understand his thoughts and actions perhaps better than he, the actor on the political scene, does himself. The concept of interest defined as power imposes intellectual discipline upon the observer, infuses rational order into the subject matter of politics, and thus makes the theoretical understanding of politics possible. On the side of the actor, it provides for rational discipline in action and creates that astounding continuity in foreign policy which makes American, British, or Russian foreign policy appear as an intelligible, rational continuum, by and large consistent within itself, regardless of the different motives, preferences, and intellectual and moral qualities of successive statesmen. A realist theory of international politics, then, will guard against two popular fallacies: the concern with motives and the concern with ideological preferences. To search for the clue to foreign policy exclusively in the motives of statesmen is both futile and deceptive. It is futile because motives are the most elusive of psychological data, distorted as they are, frequently beyond recognition, by the interests and emotions of actor and observer alike. Do we really know what our own motives are? And what do we know of the motives of others? Yet even if we had access to the real motives of statesmen, that knowledge would help us little in understanding foreign policies, and might well lead us astray. It is true that the knowledge of the statesman's motives may give us one among many clues as to what the direction of his foreign policy might be. It cannot give us, however, the one clue by which to predict his foreign policies. History shows no exact and necessary correlation between the quality of motives and the quality of foreign policy. This is true in both moral and political terms. We cannot conclude from the good intentions of a statesman that his foreign policies will be either morally praiseworthy or politically successful. Judging his motives, we can say that he will not intentionally pursue policies that are morally wrong, but we can say nothing about the probability of their success. If we want to know the moral and political qualities of his actions, we must know them, not his motives. How often have statesmen been motivated by the desire to improve the world, and ended by making it worse? And how often have they sought one goal, and ended by achieving something they neither expected nor desired? Neville Chamberlain's politics of appeasement were, as far as we can judge, inspired by good motives. He was probably less motivated by considerations of personal power than were many other British prime ministers, and he sought to preserve peace and to assure the happiness of all concerned. Yet his policies helped to make the Second World War inevitable, and to bring untold miseries to millions of men. Sir Winston Churchill's motives, on the other hand, were much less universal in scope and much more narrowly directed toward personal and national power, yet the foreign policies that sprang from these inferior motives were certainly superior in moral and political quality to those pursued by his predecessor. Judged by his motives, Robespierre was one of the most virtuous men who ever lived. Yet it was the utopian radicalism of that very virtue that made him kill those less virtuous than himself, brought him to the scaffold, and destroyed the revolution of which he was a leader. Good motives give assurance against deliberately bad policies. They do not guarantee the moral goodness and political success of the policies they inspire. What is important to know, if one wants to understand foreign policy, is not primarily the motives of a statesman, but his intellectual ability to comprehend the essentials of foreign policy, as well as his political ability to translate what he has comprehended into successful political action. It follows that while ethics in the abstract judges the moral qualities of motives, political theory must judge the political qualities of intellect, will, and action. A realist theory of international politics will also avoid the other popular fallacy of equating the foreign policies of a statesman with his philosophic or political sympathies, and of deducing the former from the latter. Statesmen, especially under contemporary conditions, may well make a habit of presenting their foreign policies in terms of their philosophic and political sympathies in order to gain popular support for them. Yet they will distinguish with Lincoln between their official duty, which is to think and act in terms of the national interest, and their personal wish, which is to see their own moral values and political principles realized throughout the world. Political realism does not require, nor does it condone, indifference to political ideals and moral principles, but it requires indeed a sharp distinction between the desirable and the possible, between what is desirable everywhere and at all times and what is possible under the concrete circumstances of time and place. It stands to reason that not all foreign policies have always followed so rational, objective, and unemotional a course. The contingent elements of personality, prejudice, and subjective preference, and of all the weaknesses of intellect and will which flesh is heir to, are bound to deflect foreign policies from their rational course, especially where foreign policy is conducted under the conditions of democratic control. The need to marshal popular emotions to the support of foreign policy cannot fail to impair the rationality of foreign policy itself. Yet a theory of foreign policy which aims at rationality must for the time being, as it were, abstract from these irrational elements and seek to paint a picture of foreign policy which presents the rational essence to be found in experience, without the contingent deviations from rationality which are also found in experience. Deviations from rationality which are not the result of the personal whim or the personal psychopathology of the policy-maker may appear contingent only from the vantage point of rationality, but may themselves be elements in a coherent system of irrationality. The conduct of the Indochina War by the United States suggests that possibility. It is a question worth looking into whether modern psychology and psychiatry have provided us with the conceptual tools which would enable us to construct, as it were, a counter-theory of irrational politics, a kind of pathology of international politics. The experience of the Indochina War suggests 5 factors such a theory might encompass: the imposition upon the empirical world of a simplistic and a priori picture of the world derived from folklore and ideological assumption, that is, the replacement of experience with superstition, the refusal to correct this picture of the world in the light of experience, the persistence in a foreign policy derived from the misperception of reality and the use of intelligence for the purpose not of adapting policy to reality but of reinterpreting reality to fit policy, the egotism of the policy makers widening the gap between perception and policy, on the one hand, and reality, on the other, finally, the urge to close the gap at least subjectively by action, any kind of action, that creates the illusion of mastery over a recalcitrant reality. According to the Wall Street Journal of April 3, 1970, the desire to do something pervades top levels of government and may overpower other, common sense advice that insists the U.S. ability to shape events is negligible. The yen for action could lead to bold policy as therapy. The difference between international politics as it actually is and irrational theory derived from it is like the difference between a photograph and a painted portrait. The photograph shows everything that can be seen by the naked eye. The painted portrait does not show everything that can be seen by the naked eye, but it shows, or at least seeks to show, one thing that the naked eye cannot see: the human essence of the person portrayed. Political realism contains not only a theoretical but also a normative element. It knows that political reality is replete with contingencies and systemic irrationalities and points to the typical influences they exert upon foreign policy. Yet it shares with all social theory the need, for the sake of theoretical understanding, to stress the rational elements of political reality, for it is these rational elements that make reality intelligible for theory. Political realism presents the theoretical construct of a rational foreign policy which experience can never completely achieve. At the same time, political realism considers irrational foreign policy to be good foreign policy, for only irrational foreign policy minimizes risks and maximizes benefits and, hence, complies both with the moral precept of prudence and the political requirement of success. Political realism wants the photographic picture of the political world to resemble as much as possible its painted portrait. Aware of the inevitable gap between good, that is, rational, foreign policy and foreign policy as it actually is, political realism maintains not only that theory must focus upon the rational elements of political reality, but also that foreign policy ought to be rational in view of its own moral and practical purposes. Hence, it is no argument against the theory here presented that actual foreign policy does not or cannot live up to it. That argument misunderstands the intention of this book, which is to present not an indiscriminate description of political reality, but a rational theory of international politics. Far from being invalidated by the fact that, for instance, a perfect balance of power policy will scarcely be found in reality, it assumes that reality, being deficient in this respect, must be understood and evaluated as an approximation to an ideal system of balance of power. 0. Realism assumes that its key concept of interest defined as power is an objective category which is universally valid, but it does not endow that concept with a meaning that is fixed once and for all. The idea of interest is indeed of the essence of politics and is unaffected by the circumstances of time and place. Thucydides's statement, born of the experiences of ancient Greece, that identity of interest is the surest of bonds whether between states or individuals, was taken up in the 19th century by Lord Salisbury's remark that the only bond of union that endures among nations is the absence of all clashing interests. It was erected into a general principle of government by George Washington. A small knowledge of human nature will convince us that, with far the greatest part of mankind, interest is the governing principle, and that almost every man is more or less under its influence. Motives of public virtue may for a time, or in particular instances, actuate men to the observance of a conduct purely disinterested, but they are not of themselves sufficient to produce persevering conformity to the refined dictates and obligations of social duty. Few men are capable of making a continual sacrifice of all views of private interest, or advantage, to the common good. It is vain to exclaim against the depravity of human nature on this account. The fact is so, the experience of every age and nation has proved it, and we must in a great measure change the constitution of man, before we can make it otherwise. No institution, not built on the presumptive truth of these maxims, can succeed. It was echoed and enlarged upon in our century by Max Weber's observation: interests, material and ideal, not ideas, dominate directly the actions of men. Yet the images of the world created by these ideas have very often served as switches determining the tracks on which the dynamism of interest kept actions moving. Yet the kind of interest determining political action in a particular period of history depends upon the political and cultural context within which foreign policy is formulated. The goals that might be pursued by nations in their foreign policy can run the whole gamut of objectives any nation has ever pursued or might possibly pursue. The same observations apply to the concept of power. Its content and the manner of its use are determined by the political and cultural environment. Power may comprise anything that establishes and maintains the control of man over man. Thus power covers all social relationships which serve that end, from physical violence to the most subtle psychological ties by which one mind controls another. Power covers the domination of man by a man, both when it is disciplined by moral ends and controlled by constitutional safeguards, as in Western democracies, and when it is that untamed and barbaric force which finds its laws in nothing but its own strength and its sole justification in its aggrandizement. Political realism does not assume that the contemporary conditions under which foreign policy operates, with their extreme instability and the ever-present threat of large-scale violence, cannot be changed. The balance of power, for instance, is indeed a perennial element of all pluralistic societies, as the authors of the Federalist Papers well knew, yet it is capable of operating, as it does in the United States, under the conditions of relative stability and peaceful conflict. If the factors that have given rise to these conditions can be duplicated on the international scene, similar conditions of stability and peace will then prevail there, as they have over long stretches of history among certain nations. What is true of the general character of international relations is also true of the nation-state as the ultimate point of reference of contemporary foreign policy. While the realist indeed believes that interest is the perennial standard by which political action must be judged and directed, the contemporary connection between interest and the nation-state is a product of history, and is therefore bound to disappear in the course of history. Nothing in the realist position militates against the assumption that the present division of the political world into nation-states will be replaced by larger units of a quite different character, more in keeping with the technical potentialities and the moral requirements of the contemporary world. The realist parts company with other schools of thought before the all-important question of how the contemporary world is to be transformed. The realist is persuaded that this transformation can be achieved only through the workmanlike manipulation of the perennial forces that have shaped the past as they will the future. The realist cannot be persuaded that we can bring about that transformation by confronting a political reality that has its own laws with an abstract ideal that refuses to take those laws into account. 0. Political realism is aware of the moral significance of political action. It is also aware of the ineluctable tension between the moral command and the requirements of successful political action. And it is unwilling to gloss over and obliterate that tension and thus to obfuscate both the moral and the political issue by making it appear as though the stark facts of politics were morally more satisfying than they actually are, and the moral law less exacting than it actually is. Realism maintains that universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in their abstract universal formulation, but that they must be filtered through the concrete circumstances of time and place. The individual may say for himself, "Fiat justitia, perit mundus, let justice be done, even if the world perish," but the state has no right to say so in the name of those who are in its care. Both individual and state must judge political action by universal moral principles, such as that of liberty. Yet while the individual has a moral right to sacrifice himself in defense of such a moral principle, the state has no right to let its moral disapprobation of the infringement of liberty get in the way of successful political action, itself inspired by the moral principle of national survival. There can be no political morality without prudence. That is, without consideration of the political consequences of seemingly moral action. Realism, then, considers prudence the weighing of the consequences of alternative political actions to be the supreme virtue in politics. Ethics in the abstract judges action by its conformity with the moral law. Political ethics judges action by its political consequences. Classical and medieval philosophy knew this, and so did Lincoln when he said, "I do the very best I know how, the very best I can, and I mean to keep doing so until the end. If the end brings me out all right, what is said against me won't amount to anything. If the end brings me out wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference." 0. Political realism refuses to identify the moral aspirations of a particular nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. As it distinguishes between truth and opinion, so it distinguishes between truth and idolatry. All nations are tempted and few have been able to resist the temptation for long to clothe their own particular aspirations and actions in the moral purposes of the universe. To know that nations are subject to the moral law is one thing, while to pretend to know with certainty what is good and evil in the relations among nations is quite another. There is a world of difference between the belief that all nations stand under the judgment of God, inscrutable to the human mind, and the blasphemous conviction that God is always on one side and that what one wills oneself cannot fail to be willed by God also. The light-hearted equation between a particular nationalism and the counsels of providence is morally indefensible, for it is that very sin of pride against which the Greek tragedians and the biblical prophets have warned rulers and ruled. That equation is also politically pernicious, for it is liable to engender the distortion in judgment which, in the blindness of crusading frenzy, destroys nations and civilizations in the name of moral principle, ideal, or God himself. On the other hand, it is exactly the concept of interest defined in terms of power that saves us from both that moral excess and that political folly. For if we look at all nations, our own included, as political entities pursuing their respective interests defined in terms of power, we are able to do justice to all of them. And we are able to do justice to all of them in a dual sense. We are able to judge other nations as we judge our own, and, having judged them in this fashion, we are then capable of pursuing policies that respect the interests of other nations, while protecting and promoting those of our own. Moderation in policy cannot fail to reflect the moderation of moral judgment. 0. The difference, then, between political realism and other schools of thought is real, and it is profound. However much the theory of political realism may have been misunderstood and misinterpreted, there is no gainsaying its distinctive intellectual and moral attitude to matters political. Intellectually, the political realist maintains the autonomy of the political sphere, as the economist, the lawyer, the moralist maintain theirs. He thinks in terms of interest defined as power, as the economist thinks in terms of interest defined as wealth. The lawyer, of the conformity of action with legal rules. The moralist, of the conformity of action with moral principles. The economist asks, how does this policy affect the wealth of society, or a segment of it? The lawyer asks, is this policy in accord with the rules of law? The moralist asks, is this policy in accord with moral principles? And the political realist asks, how does this policy affect the power of the nation, or of the federal government, of Congress, of the party, of agriculture, as the case may be? The political realist is not unaware of the existence and relevance of standards of thought other than political ones. As political realist, he cannot but subordinate these other standards to those of politics, and he parts company with other schools when they impose standards of thought appropriate to other spheres upon the political sphere. It is here that political realism takes issue with the legalistic moralistic approach to international politics. That this issue is not, as has been contended, a mere figment of the imagination, but goes to the very core of the controversy, can be shown from many historical examples. 3 will suffice to make the point. 3. In 1939, the Soviet Union attacked Finland. This action confronted France and Great Britain with 2 issues, one legal, the other political. Did that action violate the covenant of the League of Nations, and, if it did, what countermeasures should France and Great Britain take? The legal question could easily be answered in the affirmative, for obviously the Soviet Union had done what was prohibited by the covenant. The answer to the political question depends, first, upon the manner in which the Russian action affected the interests of France and Great Britain, second, upon the existing distribution of power between France and Great Britain, on the one hand, and the Soviet Union and other potentially hostile nations, especially Germany, on the other, and, third, upon the influence that the countermeasures were likely to have upon the interests of France and Great Britain and the future distribution of power. France and Great Britain, as the leading members of the League of Nations, saw to it that the Soviet Union was expelled from the League, and they were prevented from joining Finland in the war against the Soviet Union only by Sweden's refusal to allow their troops to pass through Swedish territory on their way to Finland. If this refusal by Sweden had not saved them, France and Great Britain would shortly have found themselves at war with the Soviet Union and Germany at the same time. The policy of France and Great Britain was a classic example of legalism in that they allowed the answer to the legal question, legitimate within its sphere, to determine their political actions. Instead of asking both questions, that of law and that of power, they asked only the question of law, and the answer they received could have no bearing on the issue that their very existence might have depended upon. The second example illustrates the moralistic approach to international politics. It concerns the international status of the Communist government of China. The rise of that government confronted the Western world with two issues, one moral, the other political. Were the nature and policies of that government in accord with the moral principles of the Western world? Should the Western world deal with such a government? The answer to the first question could not fail to be in the negative. Yet it did not follow with necessity that the answer to the second question should also be in the negative. The standard of thought applied to the first, the moral question, was simply to test the nature and the policies of the Communist government of China by the principles of Western morality. On the other hand, the second, the political question, had to be subjected to the complicated test of the interests involved and the power available on either side, and of the bearing of one or the other course of action upon these interests and power. The application of this test could well have led to the conclusion that it would be wiser not to deal with the Communist government of China. To arrive at this conclusion by neglecting this test altogether and answering the political question in terms of the moral issue was indeed a classic example of the moralistic approach to international politics. The third case illustrates strikingly the contrast between realism and the legalistic moralistic approach to foreign policy. Great Britain, as one of the guarantors of the neutrality of Belgium, went to war with Germany in August 1914 because Germany had violated the neutrality of Belgium. The British action could be justified either in realistic or legalistic moralistic terms. That is to say, one could argue realistically that for centuries it had been axiomatic for British foreign policy to prevent the control of the Low Countries by a hostile power. It was then not so much the violation of Belgium's neutrality per se as the hostile intentions of the violator which provided the rationale for British intervention. If the violator had been another nation but Germany, Great Britain might well have refrained from intervening. This is the position taken by Sir Edward Grey, British Foreign Secretary during that period. Under Secretary for Foreign Affairs Hardinger remarked to him in 1908, "If France violated Belgian neutrality in a war against Germany, it is doubtful whether England or Russia would move a finger to maintain Belgian neutrality, while if the neutrality of Belgium was violated by Germany, it is probable that the converse would be the case." Whereupon Sir Edward Grey replied, "This is to the point. Yet one could also take the legalistic and moralistic position that the violation of Belgium's neutrality per se, because of its legal and moral defects and regardless of the interests at stake and of the identity of the violator, justified British and, for that matter, American intervention." This was the position which Theodore Roosevelt took in his letter to Sir Edward Grey of January 22, 1915. "To me the crux of the situation has been Belgium. If England or France had acted toward Belgium as Germany has acted, I should have opposed them, exactly as I now oppose Germany. I have emphatically approved your action as a model for what should be done by those who believe that treaties should be observed in good faith and that there is such a thing as international morality. I take this position as an American who is no more an Englishman than he is a German, who endeavors loyally to serve the interests of his own country, but who also endeavors to do what he can for justice and decency as regards mankind at large, and who therefore feels obliged to judge all other nations by their conduct on any given occasion." This realist defense of the autonomy of the political sphere against its subversion by other modes of thought does not imply disregard for the existence and importance of these other modes of thought. It rather implies that each should be assigned its proper sphere and function. Political realism is based upon a pluralistic conception of human nature. Real man is a composite of economic man, political man, moral man, religious man, etc. A man who is nothing but political man would be a beast, for he would be completely lacking in moral restraints. A man who is nothing but moral man would be a fool, for he would be completely lacking in prudence. A man who is nothing but religious man would be a saint, for he would be completely lacking in worldly desires. Recognizing that these different facets of human nature exist, political realism also recognizes that in order to understand one of them one has to deal with it on its own terms. That is to say, If I want to understand religious man, I must for the time being abstract from the other aspects of human nature and deal with its religious aspect as if it were the only one. Furthermore, I must apply to the religious sphere the standards of thought appropriate to it, always remaining aware of the existence of other standards and their actual influence upon the religious qualities of man. What is true of this facet of human nature is true of all the others. No modern economist, for instance, would conceive of his science and its relations to other sciences of man in any other way. It is exactly through such a process of emancipation from other standards of thought, and the development of one appropriate to its subject matter, that economics has developed as an autonomous theory of the economic activities of man. To contribute to a similar development in the field of politics is indeed the purpose of political realism. It is in the nature of things that a theory of politics which is based upon such principles will not meet with unanimous approval, nor does, for that matter, such a foreign policy. For theory and policy alike run counter to two trends in our culture which are not able to reconcile themselves to the assumptions and results of a rational, objective theory of politics. One of these trends disparages the role of power in society on grounds that stem from the experience and philosophy of the 19th century. We shall address ourselves to this tendency later in greater detail. For the other trend, opposed to the realist theory and practice of politics, stems from the very relationship that exists, and must exist, between the human mind and the political sphere. For reasons that we shall discuss later. 5. The human mind in its day-by-day operations cannot bear to look the truth of politics straight in the face. It must disguise, distort, belittle, and embellish the truth, and more so, the more the individual is actively involved in the processes of politics, and particularly in those of international politics. For only by deceiving himself about the nature of politics and the role he plays on the political scene is man able to live contentedly as a political animal with himself and his fellow men. Thus it is inevitable that a theory which tries to understand international politics as it actually is and as it ought to be in view of its intrinsic nature, rather than as people would like to see it, must overcome a psychological resistance that most other branches of learning need not face. A book devoted to the theoretical understanding of international politics therefore requires a special explanation and justification. Chapter 1 Summary: A Realist Theory of International Relations. Modern political thought has two schools. 1. A rational moral and political order can be achieved here and now. Human nature is good and infinitely malleable. The failure of social order is a consequence of lack of knowledge and understanding, outdated social institutions, or the immorality of certain isolated individuals or groups. Solutions to remedy these effects include education, reform, and the sporadic use of force. 2. The world is imperfect because of forces inherent in human nature. Moral principles can never be fully realized. Historic precedents trump abstract principles, concerned with the realization of the lesser evil rather than the absolute good. This is called realism. 6 Principles of Political Realism. 1. Politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. Human nature has not changed. 2. International politics is the concept of interest defined in terms of power separate from other spheres of action such as economics, ethics, religion, etc. Without this separation, we could not distinguish between political and non-political facts issues nor bring the measure of systematic order to the political sphere. It is futile and deceptive to search for clues to foreign policy exclusively in the motives of statesmen. History shows no exact and necessary correlation between quality of motives and quality of foreign policy in both moral and political terms. A realist theory avoids equating foreign policy with ideological preferences. Political realism requires a sharp distinction between what is desirable everywhere and at all times and what is possible under concrete circumstances of time and place. Political realism considers a rational foreign policy a good foreign policy. A perfect balance of power policy will scarcely be found in reality. 3. The idea of interest is the essence of politics and is unaffected by the circumstances of time and place. The kind of interest determining political action in a particular period of history depends on the political and cultural context within which foreign policy is formulated. The same goes for the concept of power. Its content and the manner of its use are determined by the political and cultural environment. Realism does not assume that existing conditions under which foreign policy operates cannot be changed. The nation-state is the ultimate point of reference of contemporary foreign policy. The transformation of the contemporary world can be achieved only through the manipulation of the recurrent forces that have shaped the past as they will the future. 4. Universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in their abstract universal formulation, but must be filtered through the concrete circumstances of time and place. Prudence, the weighing of the consequences of alternative political actions, is the supreme virtue in politics. 5. Realism refuses to identify the moral ambitions of a particular nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. We are able to judge other nations as we judge our own, and having judged them in this fashion, we are capable of pursuing policies that respect the interests of other nations while protecting and promoting our own. Moderation in policy cannot fail to reflect the moderation of moral judgment. 6. The difference between realism and other schools of thought is profound. The political realist maintains autonomy of the political sphere, but recognizes different facets of human nature exist. Hans Morgenthau, 1948. Politics Among Nations, New York, Knopf, Chapters 1 and 2. Summary. Morgenthau seeks to develop a comprehensive theory of international politics, which he terms political realism. In contrast to idealism, which assumes the essential goodness and infinite malleability of human nature and the ability of politics to live up to moral standards, realism assumes that the world is composed of opposing interests and conflict among them is inevitable. Realism is fundamentally concerned with power rather than morality or material interests. Includes strong assumptions about human nature. Humans are not naturally good and conflict is the natural outcome of the search for power, not of misunderstanding. 6 Principles of Political Realism. 1. Politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. This means it is possible to develop a theory that reflects these laws and to differentiate between truth and opinion. We can put ourselves in the position of a statesman and predict what he should rationally do. 2. Interest is defined in terms of power. This sets politics apart from other spheres of action, such as economics, interest defined in terms of wealth. Because we can assume a definition of interest, we do not have to concern ourselves with questions of motives, preferences, and intellectual and moral qualities of successive statesmen. Nonetheless, later says that intellectual capability can affect a statesman's ability to comprehend the essentials of foreign policy and translate them into political action. Not all foreign policies will follow the rational course predicted by realism, due to personal weaknesses and collective irrationality, wrong ideas that have become popularly accepted, despite reality. Makes normative claims. 2. Rational foreign policy is good foreign policy because it minimizes risks and benefits and, hence, complies both with the moral precept of prudence and the political requirement of success. 3. Interest defined as power is an objective category which is universally valid, but whose meaning can change. Defines power broadly as anything that establishes and maintains the control of man over man. Also, the centrality of the nation-state is changeable over time. While the realist indeed believes that interest is the perennial standard by which political action must be judged and directed, the contemporary connection between interest and the nation-state is a product of history, and is therefore bound to disappear in the course of history. 4. Universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in the abstract. The circumstances of time and place must be considered. The state must place its survival above all other moral goods. Thus, prudence, the weighing of the consequences of alternative political actions, is the supreme virtue in politics. Actions are judged by their consequences. 5. The moral laws that govern the universe are distinct for the morals of any one nation. 6. The difference between political realism and other schools is real and profound. Realism maintains the autonomy of the political sphere and, while recognizing that different facts of human nature, economic man, religious man, etc., exist, judges that political man, interested only in power, is the appropriate facet for the study of politics. Legalistic moralist standards are appropriate to other spheres, not to politics. Critiques. From Waltz M.'s focus on human nature as the source for power-seeking requires strong assumptions. Waltz turns the focus onto structure as necessitating power-hungry states for security reasons. The concept of power is broadly defined and does not distinguish between resources that give states power, economic, military, and the act of one state exerting power over another. Politics among nations. This paper covers the analysis of the politics among nations. The subtitle of this part is The Struggle for Power and Peace. Therefore, the explanations in this paper with the author's ideas about the theory of realism and power struggle among nations. The main idea of this paper is to present the author's ideas about their chapters, to assess them and then to present critique. The structure of this paper is made up of three main parts. The first part is summary and it is about the subjects of the chapters and the author's ideas. The second part assesses the author's argument and their demonstrations. Finally, in the third part, my reactions to the author's arguments will be presented. 1. Summary. Hans Morgenthau was one of the leading 20th century figures in the study of international politics. He made landmark contributions to international relations theory and study of international law, and his book, which is Politics Among Nations, first published in 1948, went through many editions during his lifetime. Hans Morgenthau is considered one of the founding fathers of the realist school in the 20th century. This school of thought holds that nation-states are the main actors in international relations and that the main concern of the field is the study of power. Hans Morgenthau's book established realism as the fundamental way of thinking about international relations. It has a purpose to detect and understand the forces that determine political relations among nations and to comprehend the ways in which those forces act upon one another and upon international political relations and institutions. Hans Morgenthau seeks to develop a comprehensive theory of international politics. He argued that international relations should be understood within a realist, not an idealist framework. Hans Morgenthau emphasized the importance of the national interest, and in Politics Among Nations he wrote that the main signpost that helps political realism to find its way through the landscape of international politics is the concept of interest defined in terms of power. 2. Analysis. Realism is fundamentally concerned with power rather than morality or material interests. Hans Morgenthau includes strong assumption about the human nature and starts with human nature, which is not naturally good and is a source of difficulties. Conflict is a natural outcome of the search for power, not of misunderstanding. Interests were defined by power, which is the control of man over the minds and actions of other men. The struggle for power is universal in time and undeniable fact of experience. Morgenthau systematizes realism in international relations on the basis of 6 principles in the Politics Among Nations. He develops realism into both a theory of international politics and a political art, a useful tool of foreign policy. In the first principle he states that realism is based on objective laws that have their roots in unchanging human nature. The world is imperfect because of forces inherent in human nature. Moral principles can never be fully realized. He wants to develop realism into both a theory of international politics and a political art, a useful tool of foreign policy. Political realism stresses the rational, objective and unemotional. Next, power is to control of man over man. In the fourth principle, Political realism is aware of the moral significance of political action. For Morgenthau, political realism refuses to identify the moral aspirations of a particular nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. Politics is an autonomous sphere, as Morgenthau says in his sixth principle of realism. It cannot be subordinated to ethics. According to Morgenthau, interest is the central concept that makes politics into an autonomous discipline. Rational state actors pursue their national interests. It also indicates that in order to avoid conflicts, states should avoid moral crusades or ideological confrontations, and look for compromise on the basis of satisfaction of their mutual interests alone. Morgenthau regards realism as a way of thinking about international relations and a useful tool for devising policies. Morgenthau shaped the very field of international relations according to his conception not of how the world should or could work in the future but how it actually worked right now. Morgenthau claimed that whatever diplomatic posturing might be assumed, all states would seek the greatest amount of power and security possible, even to the point of using military force to achieve it, while accepting no check upon individual national sovereignty from any international or supranational. Even as he emphasized the centrality of the balance of power between nation-states as the key means by which nations could pursue both power and peace, however, he also discussed the possible role that could be played by normative limitations such as international law, international morality, and world public opinion. In the politics among nations, it is questioned that what rules of morality, mores, and law are effective on the international scene. International politics, like all politics, is for Morgenthau a struggle for power because of the basic human lust for power. He seeks the way how to achieve peace in international structure such as limitation of national power by international law, peace through limitation and peace through transformation. But no attempt to solve the problem of international peace by limiting national aspirations for power or peace through limitation has succeeded. None could have succeeded under the modern nation-states. Balance of power is no longer possible to stop war. Peace through accommodation and its interest. Diplomacy is an element of national power. Diplomacy is the best means of preserving of international peace that a society of sovereign nations has to offer, especially under the condition of contemporary war. Persuasion, compromise and threat of force, while highlighting their integral interplay, are three channels of diplomacy. For Morgenthau, diplomacy must determine its objectives in light of the power actually and potentially available for the pursuit of these objectives. To assess the objectives of other nations and the power actually and potentially available for the pursuit of these objectives. To determine to what extent these different objectives are compatible with each other, and to employ the means suited to the pursuit of its objective. Relations between states were determined above all else by the pursuit of each state for power and security. According to Hans Morgenthau, keeping power is status quo, increasing power will be imperialism like Britain, and demonstrating power will be understood well by giving an example of USA and SU during Cold War period. As a result, all use of power is evil and there is no good foreign policy. States can never be certain about the intention of other states. In addition to this, without military power, states are unable to defend their own interest. 3. Reactions. This book is extensive in terms of the sources, varieties and the evolution of the realism, international structure and struggle between nations. I agree with Morgenthau in terms of the role of the diplomacy and diplomats who ought to take to heart in order to make relations between nations more peaceful and less anarchic, such as the keeping of promises, trust in the other's word, fair dealing, respect for international law, protection of minorities, repudiation of war as an instrument of national policy in the international structure. Diplomacy is the heart of the peace. Moreover, I do agree with his support of soft power rather than hard power over nations. Soft power, which is the ability of state to influence the behavior of another state to get the outcome you want, is more effective than latter. Although I support him in some point, I do have some criticisms about the book, which is Politics Among the Nations. Power is understood as an interest, and nation-states are power-oriented actors. It is worth to mention that Hans Morgenthau focused on the human nature as a source for power-seeking instead of focusing on the structure as necessitating power-hungry states for security reasons. Morgenthau's approach is criticized by Waltz for his account of human nature is entirely hypothetical, since the true human nature is not empirically verified. Morgenthau's bottom-up approach takes human nature as the starting point and moves up the levels of analysis, while Walt's top-down approach begins at the third image and slowly moves down to the unit level, without ever reaching the individual level. The former mainly rooted the pursuit for power in human nature, while the latter emphasized international anarchy. For Morgenthau, international organization would mean the end of political power. What is striking is the fact that the author ignores the point that building international cooperation would be resulted in increasing relations between nation-states and provide them mutual understanding of their own interests. Cooperation and sharing common values in an organization will help them building peaceful environment. In my opinion, institution can alter state preferences, change state behavior, and have capability to move states away from the war. While realism is appropriate in explanation of events in certain areas of international relations, it is less able to explain international relations in the area of the world where states cooperate for collective economic, cultural, and political benefits. I disagree with the author in some point. Power is the primary consideration in international scene, and he neglects the morality, ideas, cultural factors, and ideologies. Although he believes the possibility of peaceful change within state by the ability to express public opinion freely, international moral consensus is no longer possible for the settlement of disputes among nations. He also states that there is no higher ruling body in the international system and there is no government over governments. While utopians believe in building a world politics, the realist believes that they cannot. One criticism about Morgenthau is that his focusing on the military power rather than economical, organizational, or moral power might threaten the very existence of state. Besides that, the main concern and interest of states is survival. Some critics of realism contend that survival borders on the trivial and therefore there must be some further assumption about the state preferences. Politics Among Nations Chapter 11-12. The balance of power and policies aiming at its preservation are not only inevitable but are an essential stabilizing factor in a society of sovereign nations, and the instability of the international balance of power is due not to the faultiness of the principle but to the particular conditions under which the principle must operate in a society of sovereign nations. Two assumptions are at the foundation of equilibrium. A. The elements to be balanced are necessary for society or are entitled to exist. B. Without a state of equilibrium among them, one element will gain ascendancy over the others, encroach upon their interests and rights, and may ultimately destroy them. Consequently, it is the purpose of all such equilibriums to maintain the stability of the system without destroying the multiplicity of the elements composing it. If the goal were stability alone, it could be achieved by allowing one element to destroy or overwhelm the others and take their place. The means employed to maintain the equilibrium consist in allowing the different elements to pursue their opposing tendencies up to the point where the tendency of one is not so strong as to overcome the tendency of the others, but strong enough to prevent the others from overcoming its own. Two factors are at the basis of international society: multiplicity and antagonism of its elements. Struggle for power on the international scene can be carried on in two typical patterns. 0. Pattern of direct opposition. In this pattern, the balance of power results directly from the desire of either nation to see its policies prevail over the policies of the other. So long as the BOP operates successfully in such a situation, it fulfills two functions. A. It creates a precarious stability in the relations between the respective nations, a stability that is always in danger of being disturbed and, therefore, is always in need of being restored. These relations are subject to continuous change. B. If BOP operates under these conditions, The other function is to ensure the freedom of one nation from domination by the other. 2. Pattern of competition. A's desire to dominate C is balanced by B's power. This has two functions. A. This creates a precarious stability and security in the relations between A and B. B. Safeguards the independence of C against encroachments by A or B. The balancing process can be carried on either by diminishing the weight of the heavier scale or by increasing the weight of the lighter one. The other method of balancing the power of several nations consists in adding to the strength of the weaker nation. This method can be carried out by two different means. A. Either B can increase its power sufficiently to offset, if not surpass, the power of A, and vice versa. B. Or B can pool its power with the power of all the other nations that pursue identical policies with regard to A, in which case A will pool its power with all the antions pursuing identical policies with respect to B. The former alternative is exemplified by the policy of compensations and the armament race as well as by disarmament, the latter by the policy of alliances. In the latter part of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the principle of compensations was again deliberately applied to the distribution of colonial territories and the delimitation of colonial or semi-colonial spheres of influence. No nation will agree to concede political advantages to another nation without the expectation, which may or may not be well-founded, of receiving proportionate advantages in return. Proportionate reduction of armaments is similar to territorial compensation, for both techniques require a quantitative evaluation of the influence that the arrangements are likely to exert on the respective power of the individual nations. Alliances. Whether or not a nation shall pursue a policy of alliances is, then, a matter not of principle but of expediency, pragmatism. A nation will turn away from alliances if it believes that it is strong enough to hold its own unaided or that the burden of the commitments resulting from the alliances is likely to outweigh the advantages to be expected. The distribution of benefits is thus likely to reflect the distribution of power within an alliance, as is the determination of policies. A great power has a good chance to have its way with a weak ally as concerns benefits and policies, and it is for this reason that Machiavelli warned weak nations against making alliances with strong ones except by necessity. For an alliance to be operative, that is, able to coordinate the general policies and concrete measures of its members, those members must agree not only on general objectives, but on policies and measures as well. The holder of the balance, the system may, however, consist of two scales plus a third element, the holder of the balance or the balancer. The balancer is not permanently identified with the policies of either nation or group of nations. Its only objective within the system is the maintenance of the balance, regardless of the concrete policies the balance will serve. It waits in the middle in watchful detachment to see which scale is likely to sink. Its support of lack of support is the decisive factor in the struggle for power. Hans J. Morgenthau, revised by Kenneth W. Thompson. Politics Among Nations, 1948, revised 6th ed. 1985, Chap 1. Chapter 1, A Realist Theory of International Politics. Quick summary. Political realism equals nations are conceived as political entities pursuing their respective interests defined in terms of power. Morgenthau divides the history of modern political thought into two distinct schools, realism and other, presumably idealism, that differ fundamentally in their conceptions of the nature of man, society, and politics. The other school assumes the essential goodness and infinite malleability of human nature. It sees education, increased knowledge and understanding as the path to social order and peace. Realism argues the world is a result of forces inherent in human nature, and hence fundamentally unchangeable. One must work with these forces, not against them. The world is inherently comprised of opposing interests and defined by the conflicts among them. As opposed to the alternative school, it looks to historical precedents rather than abstract principles to understand politics. It is called realism because it is concerned with human nature as it actually is, versus what it should be, and historical processes as they actually take place. 6 Principles of Political Realism. 1. Politics, like society in general, is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. These objective laws allow us to differentiate truth from opinion, the difference between objective and rational truth, supported by evidence and reason, and subjective judgment. We must also approach political reality with a rational outline map in order to understand chosen behaviors. 2. Interests are defined in terms of power. We assume that statesmen think and act in terms of interest defined as power. 5. Politics is an autonomous sphere apart from economics, ethics, religion, culture, etc. This guards against 2 popular fallacies: the concern with motives and concern with ideological preferences. Motives alone cannot predict either behavior or outcome's success and are difficult to clearly identify. The intellect, will, and action of statesmen are more important than motives. Political realism is not indifferent to political ideals and moral principles, but it distinguishes between the desirable and the possible. The rational elements are necessary to make reality intelligible for theory. 3. Interest defined as power is a universally valid objective category, but the meaning can change. The idea of interest is unaffected by time and place. This provides a link through history from Thucydides to Salisbury to Washington to Weber, etc. The kind of interest determining political action in a particular period of history, however, depends upon the political and cultural context. Goals' objectives can vary. This also applies to power, content and use of power determined by political and cultural context. Power may comprise anything that establishes and maintains the control of man over man. p. 11. The contemporary character of international relations can change. While the realist indeed believes that interest is the perennial standard by which political action must be judged and directed, the contemporary connection between interest and the nation-state is a product of history, and is therefore bound to disappear in the course of history. p. 12. Different units, larger or smaller, are possible, but such transformation can only be achieved through the manipulation of the constant forces that have shaped the past. 4. Universal moral principles must be filtered through concrete circumstances of time and place. The state has no right to allow moral principles to impinge on successful political action, because of primacy of national survival. There can be no political morality without prudence. Prudence, the weighing of the consequences of alternative political actions, is the supreme virtue in politics. 5. Moral aspirations of a particular nation do not equal the moral laws that govern the universe. Truth and idolatry are distinguished just as truth and opinion were earlier. We must be able to judge action interests from sane standards, interests defined in terms of power. 6. The difference between political realism and other schools is real and profound. The political realist subordinates standards of thought appropriate to other spheres, economic, legal, moral, etc., to those of politics. Defending the autonomy of the political sphere does not, however, disregard the existence and importance of these other modes of thought. It merely implies that each should be assigned its proper sphere and function. Must differentiate political realism with legalistic moralistic approaches to international politics. Summary of Morgenthau's A Realist Theory of International Relations. This chapter sets forth the 6 fundamental principles of political realism. For a criterion of effectiveness, the article argues that a theory must be evaluated by its purpose, in this case, bringing order and meaning to a mass of phenomena that without it would remain disconnected and unintelligible. 3. Focusing on the real and observable phenomena of international relations, political realism critiques the utopian thought of its idealist counterparts, who believe in the essential goodness and infinite malleability of human nature and who, blame the failure of the social order to measure up to the rational standards on lack of knowledge and understanding, obsolescent social institutions, or the depravity of certain isolated individuals or groups. 3. In contrast, the first principle of political realism maintains that politics are grounded in observable laws of human nature. Any idealistic attempt to challenge these laws will only lead to failure. Therefore, the project of political realists is the testing of this rational hypothesis against the actual acts and their consequences that gives theoretical meaning to the facts of international relations. 5. The second principle of political realism is the centrality of power. Realists believe that power is the main articulation of political interest, a hypothesis which can be tested by the observable actions of statesmen throughout history. By focusing on the study of political power, realists create a continuity of analysis of policy. Each state can be analyzed in terms of power politics. However, Morgenthau warns against two common misconceptions. The first, trying to understand the motives of statesmen, is faulty because motives do not always align to actual policy or outcomes of policy. And the second, the alignment of ideology with action, to which the realist responds that a policy may be articulated in terms of popular ideologies, but nevertheless remains a product of considerations of power. Only a rational foreign policy built off a reasoned analysis of international relations will be a successful foreign policy. The third principle is that while power is a universally valid concept, realism does not endow that concept with a meaning that is fixed for once and all. 11. In other words, while the unit of analysis remains power, the method and articulation of power throughout centuries has changed and will continue to do so. For example, Morgenthau writes that it is possible for a shift in scalar units of analysis, away from the nation-state, since the contemporary connection between interest and the nation-state is a product of history and therefore bound to disappear in the course of history. 11. However, realists still disagree with their idealist counterparts in believing that the transition away from the nation-state system will occur as a product of the laws of international relations, not by the reasoned pleas of a utopian minority. According to the fourth principle, political realism is aware of the moral significance of political action. 12. However, the moral principles relevant to a particular policy must be historicized and contextualized. Therefore, ethics is incorporated into political realism through the calculation of the political consequences of a particular policy or action. The fifth principle holds that political realism refuses to identify the moral aspirations of a particular nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. 12. Since nations have and will continue to disguise their particular ambitions within the language of universal morality, the shrewd realist sees through their rhetorical maneuver. Instead, power forms the basis for judging the actions of other countries and developing appropriate reactions to those actions. Lastly, the sixth principle is the acknowledgement of the primacy of political analysis in the sphere of the political. Although it may sound obvious, Morgenthau warns that policy has been repeatedly guided by legal and moral guidelines instead of strictly political considerations. As a result, the power of a country and the welfare of its citizens have been routinely endangered. Instead, realism advocates that policy must rise out of purely political analysis, an analysis of power. Politics Among Nations. The Struggle for Power and Peace, 4,752 word, 19 pages essay in politics. In 1948, a German called Hans J. Morgenthau wrote a book called Politics Among Nations, The Struggle for Power and Peace. This book was to become the bedrock of American foreign policy for much of the Cold War years, 1945-1991. Morgenthau was also very critical of American foreign policy, especially the war in Vietnam, and viewed it as very simplistic. The statesman must think in terms of the national interest conceived as power among other powers. The popular mind, unaware of the fine distractions of the statesman's thinking, reasons more often than not in the simple moralistic and legalistic terms of absolute good and evil. Morgenthau, 1978, p. 13. Morgenthau died in 1980. A supporter of his ideas called John J. Mearsheimer has stated that he would have regarded the neoconservatives' adventure in Iraq as equally flawed. Mearsheimer, 2005. Mearsheimer also goes on to say that almost all realists in the U.S. except Henry Kissinger opposed the war in Iraq. Mearsheimer, 2005. This highlights that most of the realists are collectively combined in their idea of thought. Realist influence in U.S. foreign policy really started to take hold during the presidencies of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson and peaked during the Vietnam War. The main idea of the Vietnam War was to contain and defeat the communist threat in Southeast Asia. This very similar to George W. Bush Jr.'s idea of containing and defeating terrorism in Iraq and stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction. By the end of both wars, the neoconservative and realist paradigms were in pieces due to the disastrous outcomes. Hans J. Morgenthau identified 6 key principles of a realist foreign policy in his book Politics Among Nations, The Struggle for Power and Peace. Morgenthau, 1978, 4p. 15. 1. Politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. This means that realists try and make a paradigm that can be split between the truth and opinion we can emphasize with politicians and say what course of action they should take. 2. Interest is defined in terms of power. This is the primary function of politics. Countries have interests in many parts of the world. We do not ask what motivates a country in terms of foreign politics. We question how politicians go about achieving those interests. All countries are different, and so some will behave differently to others. They might be predictable or unpredictable. Morgenthau argues in his book that predictable foreign policy can be good because it lessens risks taken and broadens the benefits of policies because that is politically successful. 3. Interest defined as power is an objective category which is universally valid but whose meaning can change. Morgenthau has described power as strength to rule people and keep control of that strength. 4. Universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in the abstract. The circumstances of time and place must be considered. The state's continuation is the primary objective of any government. Any other course of politics will be judged by the actions taken. 5. The moral laws that govern the universe are distinct for the moral of any one nation. 6. The difference between political realism and other schools is real and profound. Realism is reliant on human nature. A man who only has one objective is dangerous because that is what he strives to achieve. But to further develop realism as a theory, this man must not be included into other aspects of realism as a theory. The chapters in this dissertation discuss these 6 principles, and in the conclusion each principle will be analyzed and summarized to give an evaluation of the foreign policy theory, portraying ways how a realist foreign policy approach is and is not a suitable way to determine foreign policy. Chapter 1: How can realism be defined? Realism uses the state as the primary actor in world politics. Its main achievement is that since the purpose of the state is national survival in a hostile environment, the acquisition of power is the proper, rational and inevitable goal of foreign policy. Thus foreign politics can be defined as a struggle between power-maximizing states in a chaotic environment. Hence realism is sometimes referred to as the power politics school of thought. Although this policy does not offer adequate explanations for U.S. foreign policy towards rogue states, states whose behavior has the potential to alter external security environment in a negative way for the U.S. As James Fayron argues, the theory can explain why a state chooses bad or foolish foreign policies. Fayron, 1998. p. 291. These theories do not tell us why the U.S. does not balance against some threats. Concepts of self-help and sovereignty become integral parts of the realist view of global affairs. Since all states seek to maximize power in such a lawless world, Realism emphasizes the prevalent nature of conflict and competition in world politics. This in turn validates the acquisition of military capabilities by states, sufficient at least to deter attacks in a dangerous and uncertain world. Acceptance of the constant risk of conflict does not mean that the threat of conflict should go unchecked, since this would threaten the whole concept of the state. A technique utilized by realists in managing conflicts is through the balance of power. For example, this can be seen throughout the Cold War with the buildup of arms and the desire to build a bigger military capability to ensure that the balance of power was held between the USA and USSR. This case illustrates that power and the role power has as a major influence in international politics. This underlines the realist paradigm that international relations is based upon a hierarchy, of which it is based on power capabilities, where the principle of equality between states is non-existent since states vary in their abilities to project power. Weaker states are usually taken advantage of by stronger states. An example of this can be seen with U.S. political and economic embargo and sanctions placed on Cuba since 1959. This is the best example of a long-term attempt at trying to bring about political change in a country. Chapter 2, Politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. Morgenthau's first principle indicated that politics is governed by the rule of law and that this can be found in human nature. Realists argue that the rule of politics must make a clear-cut choice between the fact and fiction that has to be supported by reasonable debate and evidence, and it must not corrupt itself by the objective desires of politicians. An example for this can be found in the U.S. decision to go to war with Iraq in 2003. The Bush administration clearly corrupted itself in looking for evidence and reasons to invade Iraq, and in doing so produced false reasons and intelligence to support their theory that Iraq was harboring terrorists and manufacturing weapons of mass destruction. This idea is supported by Dr. David Case in his testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee. Dr. Case stated, "We have not found at this point actual weapons." David Kaye's report to Congress went further to say, "It does not mean we've concluded there are no actual weapons." K 2004. In Bush's case for starting the war against Iraq, realists would say that Bush failed to split the truth from opinion and therefore he gave a misleading reason for going to war. The war in Iraq, Bush had hoped for, would be the domino theory that the Vietnam War was supposed to be. According to Mearsheimer, Bush had hoped that by installing democracy in Iraq it would lead on to other nations having revolutions that would eventually implement a democratic government. This can be seen as going against Morgenthau's first principle. But on the other hand, we can see evidence of Morgenthau's teachings as a justification for the war in Iraq. Morgenthau's first principle of politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. Morgenthau, 1978, p. 415. This can be highlighted in foreign politics with states trying to compete against one another to be a global dominator. This objective law has its place in human nature. The USA has assumed its current position as global superpower since 1991 after the disintegration of the USSR. The attacks on the trade centers on 9 September 2001 marked a turning point in the way the USA thought it could wield its power. The USA felt as if its position as a leading superpower was under attack and tried to regain its stature and position with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But Morgenthau does not count on emotions to used as a reason to go to war, which was used under the guise of the protecting innocent people from Saddam's weapon of mass destruction threat. Morgenthau was enthusiastic to apply human nature and objective laws to his 6 principles. He used them to express his direct opposition to the war in Vietnam and how the U.S. war there could not defend it. He also highlights that the U.S. government was manipulating the public mind by avoiding inconvenient facts, by disseminating misinformation under the guise of educating the public, by convening public meetings with a pro-war policy program, by enlisting speakers who share the Freedom House agenda, in consequence by making dissent unpopular and by suggesting the dissenters are unpatriotic. Zimmer, 2011, p. 304. This can be seen in Morgenthau's first principle, as it shows that politicians' failure to split the truth and opinion can lead to a manipulation of action taken by those that are in charge and by the way they try to hold on to power. Leo Strauss, a neoconservative, seems to compliment Morgenthau on the way that human nature can affect decisions. Strauss has indicated in his work that politicians tell noble lies to help society come to terms with the action their state is about to take. Strauss believed it was for politicians to assert powerful and inspiring myths everyone could believe in. They might not be true, but they were necessary illusions. One of these was religion, and the order was the myth of the nation of America. That was the idea that the country had a unique destiny to battle against the forces of evil throughout the world. Curtis, 2004, Chapter 3, Interest is defined in terms of power. An ancient Greek philosopher called Thucydides is quoted as saying, "The do what they have to do and the weak accept what they have to accept." Strassler, 2008, p. 32. This can be highlighted in Morgenthau's second principle. Thucydides' teaching can be a primary objective of a state's acting to defend their interests. This is never more evident in American foreign policy towards Iraq. The war can be viewed as following a very clear-cut path of realism rather than neoconservatism. It can be argued that when a superpower is on the path to war, there is no state or international organization that can stop it. For example, the USSR's invasion and occupation of Afghanistan 1979–1989. This is most certainly the case with Iraq, despite various protests to the war across the globe. In the wake of terrorist attacks on the 9th September 2001, support for the war in Iraq was running high due to the information and evidence that was being provided by the Bush administration to the public. The war then began to echo that of Vietnam as Americans became bogged down in fighting insurgents and the death toll began to rise. This is evident in a Gallup poll, Figure A. Iraq War opposition, 63%, is also notable because it is the highest mistake percentage Gallup has ever measured for an active war involving the USA, surpassing by 2 percentage points to 61% who said the Vietnam War was a mistake in May 1971. Jones, Gallup, 2008. In conjunction with Morgenthau's second principle, the USA felt it was in their national interest to guarantee safety to themselves by eliminating Saddam Hussein. This in turn, it was hoped, might have a knock-on effect to the rest of the Middle East. Despite only a handful of supporters and many opponents to it, the USA took Thucydides' view to the war. This also highlighted America's commitment to spreading democracy and therefore creating a global and peaceful environment for the world and the Middle East. His second principle of Morgenthau's of interest is defined in power, can be viewed in another way, that the U.S. was securing its interests in the short to long term. Many critics have argued that the U.S. is securing its interests in the short to long term and that Iraq had to pay the price for that under the case that was peddled by the Bush administration. David Lieberfield has suggested that, in order to address why Iraq in particular was targeted, realism would also point to Iraq's geostrategic location, which impinged on multiple security concerns of the U.S., and to Iraq's unsurpassed oil reserves, which it could deploy against U.S. interests. Lieberfield, 2005, p. 4. From a realist's perspective, this can be seen as the primary goal, securing the U.S.'s interests and preventing the emergence of a hostile power, instead of the neoconservative view promoting human rights and encouraging democratization. There is further evidence that America was trying to protect its long-term interests in the oil that is in Iraq. Was during a cabinet meeting with Bush. President Bush's cabinet agreed in April 2001 that Iraq remains a destabilizing influence to the flow of oil to international markets from the Middle East, and because this is an unacceptable risk to the U.S., military intervention is necessary. Murphy, Evening Standard, 2003. This chapter has demonstrated that Morgenthau's second principle of interest is defined in terms of power has shown that states achieving and protecting their interests by using power to define them is ruthless. The assertion of American power after 9/11 was seen as a turning point, as it highlighted to the world that American power was not in terminal decline. America sought to protect itself and its national interests by the use of force. Hurrish, Frank, Mall, 2011, p. 182. Beside what many critics of the war may perceive, Henry Kissinger has claimed that it has benefited the U.S. in the long term. Kissinger, 2011. Although morality was injected into the reasoning behind the war, Strauss have advised that this is evident in Morgenthau's first principle. Morgenthau tries to express in his writings that morality and national interest should be kept apart when it comes to foreign policy. Chapter 5, Interest defined as power is an objective category which is universally valid but whose meaning can change. Morgenthau's fourth principle takes into consideration the concept that interest defined as power is an objective category which is universally valid but whose meaning can change. Morgenthau, 1978, 4p15. Morgenthau places emphasis on the defining of power. He expansively defines it as anything that establishes and maintains control over man. Morgenthau, 1978, 4p15. He also argues that meaning and definition of the nation-state changes over time, while the realist indeed believes that interest is the perennial standard by which political action must be judged and directed. The contemporary connection between interest and the nation-state is a product of history and therefore is bound to disappear in the course of history. Williams, Wright, Evans, 1993, p. 198. Realists don't assume that the world as we know it at the moment, which is divided into individual states, could be replaced by states based on a larger entity and being far from what we know now. Other thoughts of realism, which are different to Morgenthau's, ponder about how the current global state of affairs will change. Realists do accept that this change can be brought about by looking at how factors shaped the past and that similar factors could possibly shape the future. But Williams, Wright and Evans argue that realists cannot be persuaded that we can bring about a transformation by confronting a political reality that has its own laws with an abstract idea that refuses to take those laws into account. Williams, Wright, Evans, 1993, p. 198. Realism is against the idea of pacification. Realists support the theory that appeasement doesn't work by using Hitler as an example. The Bush administration took a standing point with the realist perspective when it came to foreign policy with Iraq. The policy that was taken against Iraq has been justified by Richard Pearl. The Continental Power wanted until after Hitler invaded Poland in 1939 and America waited until after September 11 to go after Osama bin Laden. Hitler's self-declared ambitions in military build-up like bin Laden's were under constant scrutiny long before the acts of aggression to which a response became unavoidable. Both could have been stopped by a relatively modest, well-timed preemption. Pearl, The Telegraph, 2002. Pearl goes on further to stress that, what risk do we run if Saddam remains in power and continues to build his arsenal of chemical and biological weapons? What dangers would follow his acquisition of nuclear weapons? We cannot know for sure. But on which side would it be better to be on? How would a decision to do nothing now and hope for best look when Saddam has nuclear weapons and he makes another run at Kuwait or succeeds Afghanistan as terrorist headquarters of the world? Pearl, The Telegraph, 2002. Pearl is highlighting the American and continuing schools of realism's thought on appeasement of a potential dangerous enemy. He is conforming to Morgenthau's third principle by applying, establishing and maintaining a certain level of control over Iraq and the people of Iraq. This highlights Morgenthau's third principle. Interest defined as power is an objective category which is universally valid but the whole mean can change. Howard Feinberg has argued that power is anything that establishes and maintains the control of man over man. Accordingly to Morgenthau's third principle, his definition of power cover not only the intrinsic power of capability, physical violence or the threat thereof, which is all that Waltz recognizes, but also that of contingent power, subtle psychological ties and mental control. National character, morale and the quality of government are found by Morgenthau to be even the most important components of power, even more so than the intrinsic capabilities. Feinberg, 1996. This highlights that power is control and that Morgenthau's third principle realizes this. But as with America, Morgenthau's third principle has realized that power has its limitations to control, as the U.S. found concerning its support from different nations leading up to the Iraq War. The critic Kenneth has argued that American justification for the war is an attempt to convince the world that to go to war is just. But it is also a classic realist sign that of an attempt at trying to take control through the power of reasoning. The urge to explain is not born out of idle curiosity alone. It is produced also by the desire to control, or at least a desire to know if control is possible. Waltz, 1996, p. 15. Despite Morgenthau's third principle, realism does not take into account the climate in which foreign policy can be applied. An important part of the realist school of thought is the balance of power. The balance of power can be applied successfully to foreign policy. The actions applied can also make the world cooperate more. There is no nation-state is trying to gain an upper hand. An example of this could be the peace that has existed between France and Germany since the end of the Second World War. Chapter 5. Universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in the abstract. The circumstances of time and place must be considered. Morgenthau's fourth principle argues that the school of realism realizes that morals can play a part in the importance of taking a political action. It also recognizes that there can be some friction created between those that want to apply those morals to a state's actions and whether or not the application of those morals on a state's action is successful or not. Realism fails to address any tension that may occur, and it does not make clear any moral or political issues which may occur by a state acting as a leader. The state may try and make its own morals appear more appealing to other nations than they actually are. Hastings argues that Morgenthau's fourth principle advocates that some states may act even if the moral is indefensible or even morally wrong. Relations between states as leaders must sometimes take actions considered morally wrong in order to best serve the interest of those to whom they are accountable. I.e. the people. Hastings, academia.edu. Morgenthau insists that realism cannot apply morals to states' actions. Political realism is aware of the moral significance of political action. It is also aware of the ineluctable tension between the moral command and the requirements of successful political action. And it is unwilling to gloss over and obliterate that tension and thus to obfuscate both the moral and the political issue by making it appear as though the stark facts of politics were morally more satisfying than they actually are, and the moral law less exacting than it actually is. Myers, 2006, p. 14. Morgenthau's argument highlights the fact that the state has an obligation to continued function as one, and to protect its people that are within the state. According to Kenneth, he argues that it is in the intrinsic nature of the human actors who control the states that cause states to behave in the way they do. Kenneth, 2006, p. 4. This suggests that there can be no morality in politics unless there is careful management. If states' actors do not take into consideration the results of their actions, then this can risk upsetting the balance of power. Realism does come to the conclusion that any form of political action is bad despite states' morals. This is due to an outcome that is going to be unfavorable to any actors involved despite any judgments passed on actions taken. An example of this can be U.S. foreign policy in Iraq. The U.S. actions in Iraq can be considered a clear reflection of Morgenthau's fourth principle. This because of the U.S. taking a course of action that other states' actors did not agree with. This can be seen in Figure B with a steady decrease in the popularity of America after the invasion of Iraq. The chart shows the opinions of Western European countries. In realist terms, the primary objectives of the American government after the September 11th attacks was to gain a foothold in the Middle East that would give access to other parts of the world. Many saw the Americans' actions as unfavorable, and that prompted them to say that the American attack on Iraq was for its oil reserves. The Bush administration came to the conclusion that it would be better to invade Iraq and eradicate it of terrorism altogether rather than hunt individual terrorists. Bush, prior to the invasion of Iraq, squarely pinned the blame for anti-Americanism onto the shoulders of Iraq and other dictatorships in the Middle East. This argument has been supported by Tom Lindbergh and Suzanne Mossel. Given the links drawn by everyone from Osama bin Laden to President Bush between the Iraqi insurgency and the fight against al-Qaeda, it becomes clear that anti-Americanism plays at least some role in motivating those who aid and abet the Iraqi insurgency with financing, shelter, and other forms of support. Lindbergh, Mossel, The Princeton Project of National Security, p. 13. As Morgenthau's four principle reiterates, some actions taken are going to be unfavorable to others. For realists, the invasion of the country was illogical, with the evidence given. This is because national security and the continuation of the state take priority above any other interest which may be had, even if the political decision is unfavorable. The U.S. did perceive that Iran and Syria did pose a threat against the USA. But with the U.S. having such a close force to these threats, it could be in a better position to take action against one if the need was there. Bush, it could be argued, was using the domino theory as exactly as was employed in Vietnam. Chapter 6, The Moral Laws That Govern the Universe Are Distinct for the Moral of Any One Nation. Review of Politics Among Nations. Politics Essay. Politics Among Nations is a book based on the theory of realism. Realists believe that a man is selfish and egoistic and his ultimate goal is his self-interest. Hans J. Morgenthau, the author of this book, was born in 1904 and died in 1979. He was an American citizen. He is known as the father of political realism. This book purports to present a theory of international politics. The test by which such a theory must be judged is not a priori and abstract, not empirical and pragmatic. The theory, in other words, must be judged not by some preconceived abstract principle or concept unrelated to reality, but by its purpose to bring order and meaning to a mass of phenomena which without it would remain disconnected and unintelligible. His book Politics Among Nations literary defined the IR field in 1948 as it heralded the post-World War II paradigm shift in American thinking about diplomacy, as it emphasized the power interests. During the period of Cold War, this book was largely followed by those Americans who made policies and worked on the international relations. Before the publishment of this book, the concept of idealism was almost overwhelmed by all the states of the world. But after the publishment of this book, it gave the concept of realism a new soul and opens the new dimensions of the political realism to the world. Realism refuses to equate the moral principles of any given nation or time with overall moral laws that govern the universe. Political realism maintains a separation and integrity of intellectual substance, while recognizing other frameworks. This book has two purposes. The first is to detect and understand the forces that determine the political relations among nations and to comprehend the ways in which those forces act upon each other and upon international political relations and institutions. In most other branches of social sciences, this purpose would be taken for granted because the natural aim of all scientific undertakings is to discover the forces underlying social phenomena and the mode of their operation. The most formidable difficulty facing the theoretical politics is the ambiguity of the material with which the observer has to deal. The events he must try to understand are on the one hand unique occurrences. They happened in this way only one and never before or since. On the other hand, they are similar, for they are manifestations of social forces. Social forces are the product of human nature in action. Therefore, under similar conditions, they will manifest themselves in a similar manner. But where is the line to be drawn between the similar and the unique? Ambiguity is still there. International politics is, like all politics, is a struggle for power. Whatever the ultimate aims of international politics, power is always the immediate aim. Two conclusions follow from this concept of international politics. First, not every action that a nation performs with respect to another nation is of a political nature. Second, not all the nations are at all times to the same extent involved in international politics. The degree of their involvement may run all the way for the maximum at present attained by the United States and the Soviet Union, through the maximum involvement of such countries as Switzerland, Luxembourg or Venezuela to the complete non-involvement of Liechtenstein and Monaco. The nature of the political power is defined as a psychological relation between those who exercise it and those over whom it is exercised. It gives the former control over certain actions of the latter through the impact which the former exert on the latter. Trademark minds that impact derives from three sources: the expectations of benefits, the fear of disadvantages, the respect or love for man or institutions. Hans J. Morgenthau is of the opinion that the struggle for power can be achieved through the policy of status quo, policy of the imperialism, and through the policy of prestige. Status quo is a diplomatic term referring to usual clauses in peace treaties which provide for the evacuation of territory by enemy troops and its restoration to the pre-war sovereignty. As we all know, for realists, power is the currency of the international relations, and it can also be achieved through imperialism. Imperialism used as synonymous with any kind of colonial expansion. Imperialism mean whatever the colonial masters think, behaves and acted is right and adoptable, nevertheless without pondering by the colonial states that it is suitable to them or not. The policy of prestige has rarely been recognized in modern political literature for what it is, the third of the basic manifestations of the struggle for power on the international scene. The policy of prestige shares this neglect with the subtle and intangible relationship, the understanding of which, as we have seen, has suffered from the predominant theoretical and practical concern with the material aspect of power in the form of force actual or threatened. Furthermore, the policy of prestige has used as one of its main vehicles the aristocratic form of social intercourse practiced in the diplomatic world. The policy of prestige is one of the instrumentalities through which the polices of the status quo and of imperialism try to achieve their ends. It is attained through diplomacy, negotiations and table talking. Trademark S. Hans J. Morgenthau also emphasized in his book about the concept of national power. He talked about the essence of national power and its elements that are geography, population and natural resources, industrial capacity, military preparedness like technology, leadership and quality and quantity of armed forces. We see that Japan is a small country lack of natural resources, but still it is one of the developed countries of the world because its population is well trained and well skilled. Population also matters a lot. China is the largest populated country in the world, and China uses its trademark S power in the right direction and developed rapidly because of cheap labor force. America is having the strongest military, well-equipped and well-trained because of its army. It is one of the stakeholder in international affairs. Countries like Canada and Norway voluntarily come forward and act as mediator. If a conflict arises between any two countries of the world, so this kind of attitude of their national image also considered their national power. In the next portion of his book he talked about the limitation on the national power. He talked about the two patterns of the balance of power, that is the pattern of direct opposition and the pattern of competition. There are four methods of balance of power named as divide and rule, compensations, armaments, alliances. The structure of the balance of power consists of dominant and dependent systems. When there is no balance of power between two states, the system of compulsion exists, but when there is balance of power between two countries, the system of deterrence exists. International morality and world public opinion also act as an impediment in the way of implementation of national power. For example, Bush attacked on Iraq and neglects the basic rights of Iraqi citizens. The whole world condemned this act, and Bush was castigated severely by all over the world because he neglects all the basic tools of morality. Hans J. Morgenthau also considered international law an obstacle and limitation in the exercise of national power. Before the use of national power, we will have to see that it is not against the spirit of international law. There are international courts which determine that no state violates the international law and every state is working in its own sphere. Then he talked about the concept of sovereignty. He talked about Hertz sovereignty is challenged due to globalization, transnational movements and transnational crimes. These are the threats to the sovereignty of the modern state. He talked about the role of multinational corporations and non-governmental organizations in decision-making and their influence on the state. In the last section of his book he was mostly concerned with peace, 2 world wars within a generation and the potentialities of the nuclear warfare have made the establishment of international order and the preservation of international peace the paramount concern of Western civilization. Disarmament is the reduction or elimination of certain or all armament for the purpose of ending the armament race. It is believed that, by doing away with one of the typical manifestation of the struggle of the power on the international scene, one can do away with the typical effects of that struggle, international anarchy. Conclusion. In a nutshell, I want to say that if someone wants a complete understanding to the subject of political realism, he should read this book. This book gives the reader a complete understanding of all the topics related to political realism. We are easily able to judge the worth or value of this book by finding the fact that after the publishment of this book, it is not read only by all the people of the world, but the decisions of the foreign policy had been made in the past on the basis this book. The decisions had been taken on foreign policy in the Cold War era between USA and USSR is highly influenced and inspired from this book. The 6 principles of political realism and termed the international politics as a struggle for power is Morgenthau's remarkable achievements. He talked about the concept of national power and also defined its limitations at our balance of power, international morality and international law. Hans.J.Morgenthau for the very first time talked about the new balance of power and states the reason of the decline of the West and also talked about the colonial revolution. In his book, he also concerned with peace and discussed the problems of peace. He was of the view that peace can be restored in this world by following a strategy of disarmament, collective security, by making alliances like League of Nations and international government like United Nations. Quizlet. Politics Among Nations O. Published in 1948, established principles of political realism. Main goal of states in classical realism O. Accumulate relative power and guarantee security and survival. States' actions have moral significance, but these morals are not universal. In this theory, liberalism leads to fascism. States with similar levels of power tend to avoid conflict. Distribution and balance of state power only means of avoiding state conflict. Principle 1 Politics are governed by objective laws that have their roots in human roots. Description. We can put ourselves in the position of a lawmaker and examine reasons and objectives because laws are in line with human nature. Principle 2 Interest is defined in terms of power. Description. Unlike economic, the driving force self-interest for power, we don't have to wonder motives because they are apparent. Principle 3 Interest defined as power is an objective category which is universally valid, but whose meaning can change. Description. Occasionally public interest will change. It is virtually impossible for a lawmaker to sacrifice all self-interest for public interest. Principle 4 Universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in the abstract. Description. Survival of the state will always be prioritized before morality. Principle 5 The moral laws that govern the universe are distinct for the morals of any one nation. Description. God is not with any certain country. This belief led to endless war and chaos. Principle 6.0. The difference between political realism and other schools is real and profound. Description. This is just self-advertising that political realism is the most effective tool of study in IR. Hans Morgenthau and the Balance of Power in Asia. The father of realism in international relations envisioned China's rise, the U.S. rebalance, and the Asian century. Hans Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations, originally published in 1948, is the Bible of the realist school of international relations. A less well-known work, Truth and Power, is a collection of essays that he wrote during the 1960s, which includes a 1968 piece entitled The Far East, wherein Morgenthau applied his realist approach to the balance of power in Asia and envisioned a world where China is the most powerful nation on earth. Morgenthau was born in Germany in 1904, educated at the universities of Berlin, Frankfurt and Munich, practiced law for a time, and taught in Frankfurt, Geneva and Madrid before coming to the United States in 1937. After teaching stints in Brooklyn and Kansas City, Morgenthau in 1943 settled into his professorship at the University of Chicago, where he taught for the next 30 years. He ended his teaching career at the City University of New York. In Politics Among Nations, Morgenthau defined international politics as the struggle for power and power politics. The aspiration for power, he wrote, is the distinguishing element of international politics. The struggle for power, he continued, is universal in time and space and is an undeniable fact of experience. He set forth 6 principles of political realism. 1. Politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. 2. Statesmen conduct themselves in terms of interest defined as power. 3. Interest determines political conduct within the political and cultural context which foreign policy is formulated. 4. Prudence is the supreme virtue in international politics. 5. Nations are entities that pursue their interests as defined by power and should not be judged by universal moral principles. 6. Political realism rejects the legalistic moralistic approach to international politics. Morgenthau identified the elements of national power as geography, natural resources, industrial capacity, military preparedness, population, national character, national morale, the quality of diplomacy, and the quality of government. He judged the quality of diplomacy as the most important of these factors. A nation's diplomacy, he wrote, combines those different factors into an integrated whole, gives them direction and weight, and awakens their slumbering potentialities by giving them the breadth of actual power. In Politics Among Nations, Morgenthau suggested that developments in Asia, and especially in China, may well in the long run carry the gravest implications for the rest of the world. It is in Asia, he explained, that nations with space, natural resources, and great masses of men are just beginning to use political power, modern technology, and modern moral ideas for their ends. The awakening masses of Asia, he wrote, will sooner or later come into full possession of those instruments of modern technology, especially in the nuclear field, which until recently have been a virtual monopoly of the West. This development would result in a drastic distribution of power, he continued, and would be more important than any other factor to the future of the world. The balance of power in world politics. The balance of power, a notoriously slippery, murky, and protean term, endlessly debated and variously defined, is the core theory of international politics within the realist perspective. A balance of power system is one in which the power held and exercised by states within the system is checked and balanced by the power of others. Thus, As a nation's power grows to the point that it menaces other powerful states, a counterbalancing coalition emerges to restrain the rising power, such that any bid for world hegemony will be self-defeating. The minimum requirements for a balance of power system include the existence of at least two or more actors of roughly equal strength, states seeking to survive and preserve their autonomy, alliance flexibility, and the ability to resort to war if need be. At its essence, balance of power is a type of international order. Theorists disagree, however, about the normal operation of the balance of power. Structural realists describe an automatic version of the theory, whereby system balance is a spontaneously generated, self-regulating, and entirely unintended outcome of states pursuing their narrow self-interests. Earlier versions of balance of power were more consistent with the semi-automatic version of the theory, which requires a balancer state throwing its weight on one side of the scale or the other, depending on which is lighter, to regulate the system. The British school's discussion of balance of power depicts a manually operated system, wherein the process of equilibrium is a function of human contrivance, with emphasis on the skill of diplomats and statesmen, a sense of community of nations, of shared responsibility, and a desire and need to preserve the balance of power system. As one would expect of a theory that made its appearance in the mid-16th century, balance of power is not without its critics. Liberals claim that globalization, democratic peace, and international institutions have fundamentally transformed international relations, moving it out of the realm of power politics. Constructivists claim that balance of power theory's focus on material forces misses the central role played by ideational factors such as norms and identities in the construction of threats and alliances. Realists, themselves, wonder why no global balance of power has materialized since the end of the Cold War. Introduction. The idea of balance of power in international politics arose during the Renaissance Age as a metaphorical concept borrowed from other fields: ethics, the arts, philosophy, law, medicine, economics, and the sciences, where balancing and its relation to equipoise and counterweight had already gained broad acceptance. Wherever it was applied, the balance metaphor was conceived as a law of nature underlying most things we find appealing, whether order, peace, justice, fairness, moderation, symmetry, harmony, or beauty. In the words of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the balance existing between the power of these diverse members of the European society is more the work of nature than of art. It maintains itself without effort, in such a manner that if it sinks on one side, it re-establishes itself very soon on the other. 2. Centuries later, this Renaissance image of balance as an automatic response driven by a law of nature still suffuses analysis of how the theory operates within the sphere of international relations. Thus, Hans Morgenthau explained, the aspiration for power on the part of several nations, each trying either to maintain or overthrow the status quo, leads of necessity to a configuration that is called the balance of power and to policies that aim at preserving it. 3. Similarly, Kenneth declared, as nature abhors a vacuum, so international politics abhors unbalanced power. 4. Christopher Lane likewise avers, great powers balance against each other because structural constraints impel them to do so. 5. Realists, such as Arnold Wolfers, invoke the same law of nature metaphor to explain opportunistic expansion. Since nations, like nature, are said to abhor a vacuum, one could predict that the powerful nation would feel compelled to fill the vacuum with its own power. 6. Using similar structural incentives for gains logic, John Mearsheimer claims that status quo powers are rarely found in world politics because the international system creates powerful incentives for states to look for opportunities to gain power at the expense of rivals, and to take advantage of those situations when the benefits outweigh the costs. 7.